Today we're at the historic Evergreen Cemetery, located in one of the corners of Riverside's original Miles Square. This land was set aside when the Southern California Colony Association mapped Riverside in 1870. Some of the original pioneers are actually buried here, and other very famous Riverside notables like George Wong, who has a street named after him. He was the last resident of Riverside's second Chinatown. There's also a famous opera singer that's buried here. Her name was Sarah Marcia Kraft, or Maricela Marcia Kraft, and she started Riverside's Opera Association. So this place is rich with history. It's part of what makes Riverside what it is today. It has all of the stories here in one location, Riverside's historic Evergreen Cemetery.
Hi, Erin. Hi, I'm Donna Doty Michalka.
Oh, nice to
This
meet
is
you.
Nancy Cox.
Hi, Erin. Welcome to Evergreen Memorial Historic Cemetery.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me here today.
Oh, we're glad to.
So tell me about the cemetery.
Well, this is Riverside's oldest cemetery. It was built in
1872.
1872. Wow. And it's recently been renovated thanks to the generosity of the people of Riverside. So we'd like you to come on in with us and take a look.
Okay, let's go.
We'll open these gates.
Tell me about this wonderful structure.
Well, this is called the Ice House, and it has a long history, and you probably noticed it's under construction right now. We're renovating it.
Yes, it was built 110 years ago in 1902. The permit was issued, and it was originally known as a receiving vault. This is where bodies were brought. Usually they were buried within 24 hours because we didn't have refrigeration in those days. And so ice was used. And during the 1918 flu pandemic, there were a lot of bodies, and it's presumed that that's when the term ice house came into use because there were so many bodies that needed to get in the ground and so much ice was needed.
You know, and an interesting thing I learned, Erin, was back in the 1800s and long before, they always buried people next to churches. And there was a doctor in Boston, but he determined that that was really unsanitary because during floods, the coffins and the bodies would rise to the surface. And he said cemeteries should be built in a suburban area away from the major city. And Riverside was probably one of the earliest places in the nation that actually thought to purchase land and build this beautiful cemetery out here where it was safer and it could be an open-air museum.
So this is also a ways from the downtown area then, in that sort of suburban area of that time.
And that's why.
And there are no local churches in the nearby vicinity. Also, it should be noted that it has never been a city-owned cemetery. It's always been private.
Oh, okay.
And the plots are owned by families.
So I've heard that there's a lot of local celebrities and local significant people that are buried here. Will you show me some of the sites?
Yes, we'd love to.
We would. Come
Thank
follow
you.
us.
This is quite a monument. Can you tell me about this one?
Yeah, isn't this beautiful? It was erected by the Riverside African American Historical Society.
The society raised money for all of the names that are mentioned on the front of this, and on the back of it lists the donors who contributed money to this to honor all the African American pioneers who came to Riverside in the early years.
Well, it certainly is an impressive monument.
Now we want to show you some of the veteran sites.
Okay, now we are at the GAR Circle. GAR stands for Grand Army of the Republic, which was formed by the veterans who survived the Civil War. And many of them relocated from their home areas after the war ended and settled in Riverside. And as you look at the monuments, you can see the states where they originally entered the Civil War. We also have some Spanish-American War veterans buried here, and even a couple of wives that joined their husbands in the GAR Circle. We have less than 100, I believe, in this circle.
You know, another interesting thing, Erin, is besides having all the war veterans represented here, there were a lot of people that came here from other countries and ended up in this site. Greece, Sweden, Mexico, Korea, China, just an enormous international group of people that are here too.
So you mean beyond just visiting, you're talking about people actually interned here?
Yes, but they came to Riverside and died here and were buried here. So that's a pretty interesting fact back when we had such a small population relative to now.
I see WRC on the monument as well. Can you tell me what that stands for?
Yes, that's the Women's Relief Corps. They were an auxiliary for the Grand Army of the Republic.
Okay.
And in many cases on Memorial Day, they would present wreaths on those buried that had fought in the war.
So they were an integral part in this monument as well as in recognizing the veterans.
Yes, they were an organization throughout the nation, but specifically we had one here in Riverside.
So now we're at the highest point in the cemetery, and these gravestones look to be significantly older than where we just were.
Yes, this is the oldest part of the cemetery. It was built first, and then the larger part down the hill here came afterwards.
Okay.
Yes, this is called Pioneer Meadows, and obvious there are pioneers of Riverside buried here, and we'll be visiting their graves in just a few moments. This was established in 1872, whereas across the street, that section is known as Evergreen Valley, and it was purchased and recorded in 1898 on the books, so that's when it was acquired. And so you can notice the difference in the burial dates kind of match up over there. You start seeing them after 1895, 1898.
So here's where it all began, John North.
We have a high school named after John W. North because he was the founder of Riverside. He sent out a mailer throughout the country at that time, prior to 1870. He was looking for a utopia, and he wanted others to join him that had similar interests. He was a prohibitionist, and he was also an abolitionist. So he didn't believe in slavery, and he was part of the nominating committee to nominate Abraham Lincoln. It's possible that he bought the first plot because he's in plot number 1 on the Evergreen plot map.
Well, it's really an impressive monument.
Yes, it is. And he was an attorney and also a judge in Nevada Territory. And interestingly, though, he did not die in Riverside. He left Riverside after a short time and ultimately passed away in Fresno. But his son remained here, and he was an attorney as well, and his gravestone is right behind you.
I see this impressive monument here, but then there's also a flat stone here. Why is there two?
The flat stone has an inscription at the bottom, and the Pioneer Historical Society provided and dedicated that headstone.
So here we are at Shugart. The monument is fairly blank, so can you tell me more about him and why he was important?
Certainly. I think Donna had mentioned earlier that he was a doctor, and he and his family came out here. They answered the newspaper article that John North had written because they were interested in the same kinds of a colony. And they suffered from ill health, and so they wanted to come to a better climate as well. And sadly, though, after they got here, Dr. Shugart's daughter, Leila, whose headstone is here, died at the age of 16. And so she was buried at home because the cemetery hadn't been established yet.
Okay.
And then once it was, then she was reinterred here at Evergreen.
So you mentioned that she was moved here after the cemetery opened. Does that mean she was the first person to be buried here?
That's the account that we have been told. There is another account that another gentleman was buried here first, but we don't have validation on that. So we go with the version that Leila Shugart was the first.
So even though John North's plot was number 1, yes, this was the first person to be buried.
Correct, yes. And I believe Shugart is plot number 2.
So here we are at the Tibbets Monuments.
Yes, this vertical monument is a tribute to Luther Tibbets, and the flat monument is for Eliza, his wife. And as you probably know, Eliza wrote to a friend of hers in Washington, D.C., and he had been with the Department of Agriculture, and she asked him if he had any citrus that might be appropriate for this Mediterranean type climate. And so he sent her these two trees, known then as the Bahia orange tree and later known as the Washington Navel. And she planted them at their residence, and the folklore is that she watered them with dishwater, which is possibly true because we didn't have the canal system in at that time.
And water would have been
scarce and very precious. And her husband Luther was responsible for taking the buds and grafting trees and selling those, and that eventually became the orange industry that we know of today in this area.
So here's a name we all recognize, Frank Miller.
Yes, Frank Augustus Miller, master of the inn, and of course we're talking about the Mission Inn in Riverside. He and his family are located throughout this plot on the corner of 14th and Cedar here at Evergreen. And Frank had one daughter, Alice, A-L-L-I-S, and she and her family are buried on the other side of this monument. And Frank's parents are also here, but they're noted only by the inscription Father and Mother. Not only was he the master of the Mission Inn, his father began the Glenwood Inn, but he continued to add on to it until it became known as the Mission Inn around 1903. But he also was a developer, if you will, for Riverside, and making sure that there was a network established for the greater good of Riverside's businesses and organizations.
He was quite the promoter for Riverside.
Definitely.
It seems really appropriate that the cemetery is at the base of Mount Rubidoux, too,
Absolutely.
Which is something that we owe to Frank Miller. So as we've been walking around this cemetery, clearly the majority, if not nearly all, of the monuments are made out of stone. This is not made out of stone.
It looks like it though, doesn't it?
There are parts of it that do, like the base, but...
Well, tap on it.
Aha, it's made of metal.
Yes, it is. And the back side says that it was made by the Detroit Bronze Company. So many people think it's made out of bronze that's just aged, but actually it was made out of zinc. And as you can see, the date on this is not visible. It was dedicated in 1884, I believe, provided by the two sons of Orson and Caroline Johnson, who actually arrived in Riverside with their adult children late in life, and they were just here about 3 years and died around 1883.
So I recognize this as a revival style, which means that it was certainly later than the beginning of this cemetery.
Yes, this is our mausoleum, and it's an Egyptian revival style. It was built in 1915, and you notice that it has the Egyptian details. On either side of the entrance doors are the illusion of papyrus columns, and above there are 5 smaller ones, and then alongside the front of the facade. And that's why the lotus is represented in the stained glass windows.
And this was designed by...
Famous Riverside architect Henry Jekyll.
Okay.
And not only did he design our mausoleum in 1915, but in 1940 he was called back to design our office, which is on the corner of Pine and 14th. He was also famous for many houses, as I'm sure you know, and other buildings, including Benedict Castle, which is now known as Teen Challenge.
This monument is substantially different than the other monuments that we've seen up to this point.
Yes, you know, Erin, Nancy has been working with the cemetery and researching it for a very long time. My knowledge is only more recent, but if you lived here in the 1970s, you probably remember that this was in terrible disrepair. As a matter of fact, the Press Enterprise reported that in one day alone, more than 72 headstones were vandalized. And I think that the cemetery's image was also tarnished by a law that was passed in 1937. It said that from that point on, everyone who was buried in a cemetery, money had to be contributed towards the endowment to continue to maintain the cemetery. So this section of the cemetery, the Pioneer section in particular, which has people from much earlier, could not then receive money for maintenance or water or any kind of restoration. So the two together kind of came to a head, and it was then that the city started to look at really doing something different. The city of Riverside was wonderful. They were able to locate CDBG funds, Community Development Block Grant funds, and they started putting in infrastructure, curbs, streets, street lights, things like that. And then along came the wonderful but now deceased Judge Vic Maselli, who really was the one who looked at this and said, this is a disgrace. I read a quote from Benjamin Franklin, and it said, "Show me your cemeteries and I will tell you what kind of people you have." And I think Vic Maselli and the rest of this community wanted to show what kind of people we have, because they started a campaign to raise money. And we had an anonymous donor at the time who said that he would donate up to $500,000 if the community would match it, for a total of $1 million. And just recently we hit that milestone for $1 million. And you can see as you look around what that money has done for us and for this beautiful open air museum.
And what a good way to refer to it too, as an open air museum.
Yes, and as a matter of fact, in the early days, it was a very open central place. People gathered here, there were sort of civic activities, and nowadays we hold events here to commemorate different things and raise money to also augment the maintenance, such as the 4th of July. We have a Founders Day front row fireworks, and we call it that because we truly are the front row of Mount Rubidoux, which is where our premier fireworks display is sent off.
It would be hard to believe that a view from here wouldn't be matched by anywhere else in the city.
No, just look around. It's absolutely breathtaking.
Thank you very much for joining us to see another episode of Riverside's Historic Destinations. I know that I learned a lot about Riverside's history today just from this one place, historic Riverside Evergreen Cemetery. And our guests of the show were also very helpful with so much information that taught us a lot about this special place. And so with that, I want to encourage all of you to go out into Riverside and find your own historic destination.